Greetings and salutations, friends. Character NPC back at the gaming table. Continuing on with the Invasion Malta tutorials, I'm going to go over the scenarios from the scenario booklet you see on the table and talk about a little bit about the maps and try to clarify some of the most common questions that I see posted. As I've said before, Invasion Malta is really more of a simulation than a game. And this has 4 scenarios. 3 of them cover Malta, which was the German Operation Hercules, which did not take place. They never invaded the island of Malta. Mussolini had intended on invading Malta early on, but it was really pretty fanciful. I think most historians would agree. However, the German plan was for mid-July of 1942, and the 4th scenario is Invasion Laros, which I've shown you before and we'll talk about in a little more detail, which was planned for or executed September 26th of 1943 through November 12th of 1943. We'll see some of this detail within the scenario booklet, but basically the 4 scenarios which are in this game are Malta in 1940 is scenario 1. If the invasion had taken place in 1941, rather, scenario 2, or in scenario 3, again, 1942. So 40, 41, and 42 are the Malta scenarios. And then the final scenario 4 is the actual Laros invasion in 1943. It covers the full time span, what might have happened if Malta had been invaded. Let's start with scenario 1. I'm not going to go into every bit of detail, but I want to get into the weeds a little bit because a lot of questions arose from both, what are the contradictions and how turn 1, being the invasion, is different in various sections of the rules. It seems to contradict when it really isn't. It's because it's a surprise invasion, right? So I'll get into that a little bit, but I'm not going to go into everything. Here you'll see some historical background to each one of the scenarios. It's really good information. I love it. I want to mention again the companion book that John Burt wrote that goes along with this, really goes into detail about Operation Hercules that the Germans planned. So definitely make sure to pick that up. It's a great read, and if you're a historical wargamer, it goes right along with this simulation. So without further delay, the details of a scenario are listed in the section on each page. The required components, of course, are just, having the right setup card along with the right map. There's 2 different maps. You have the scenario length. Here, this first one is 11 turns. Game turns 1, 2, and 3 are good weather. Use the weather table for each turn starting at game turn 4. And you have a motor pool in every scenario, which reflects the limited amount of fuel and supplies that are on each of the islands, as well as the ability for the Allies to provide trucks, jeeps, and those kinds of things to get units moved around. So the motor pool is important and different in each one of the scenarios. Now to the real meat and potatoes of the matter here. You'll see that in each of these scenarios, the first turn is really the invasion turn and is a bit unique. So again, I'm going to go through some of the details here. In this one, the scenario starts with an amphibious invasion. The Axis player picks the invasion zone for the first convoy before the Allied player places his units. That does not mean places any units. If you look in the rules, what you'll find is that under rules section 414, step 1 with the game turn marker and the motor pool and everything, and then step 2 is the initial placement. It shows here the Allied player examines at start sections of the setup card. Allied units are divided into 2 groups, And on the setup card, you'll notice that there is an actual A and B. Here is an example of a setup card. We have Group A. Let me back this out. Group A here. And then Group B. So in the scenario, when it discusses choosing the placement of the naval invasion zones for the convoys, it's really talking about after Group A is placed. Here, again, we're starting the scenario with an amphibious landing, and you're choosing, the Axis player, is choosing the invasion zone markers. So you can see here, you would put the invasion zone marker. As an example, I have the invasion zone markers placed over here. Next, we have detail for the Axis Friuli formation, saying that it's already activated at the first activation. Its Convoy 1 conducts naval transport to an invasion zone to conduct amphibious invasions. Its activation marker, sometimes you'll see in the rules AM, actually only in one place, I think, do you see AM used for AM versus PM. Everywhere else, you're going to see AM as activation markers. So try not to get confused there. Unless it's talking about time, AM always refers to activation markers. But the point to this in the scenario is that the activation marker goes into the opaque cup for a regular activation later on in game turn 1, in effect getting 2 activations on game turn 1 for the Friuli organization. Here you can see the Friuli units. Here the activation marker, and notice that all of these units have the FR listed in the corner, which is the unit, and the unit activation marker is this brownish color. It also is this brownish color throughout the unit counters. So it's easy to distinguish which are the Friuli units and the organization as a whole. So in effect, again, what it's saying is that when the Friuli organization activates, it's the entire thing. If you have part of them landed and part of them still on the setup card because they haven't completed their amphibious landings or their paradrops, the entire organization is activated. I hope that's clear enough. You know, things that are already landed would be activated, as well as, say, your amphibious landing or your airdrop units. You can see here it says that when Friuli activates again, the Friuli Convoy 2 activates and conducts naval transport to an invasion zone to conduct amphibious invasion. Any Friuli units already on land are also activated. That does not mean, you'll notice here that the Friuli 2, Convoy 2 here, says that it comes in game turn 2. That is not a contradiction. While the Friuli activation marker would be in the cup and be eligible to draw again, if you were to draw it again first thing in game turn 1, then you would be able to activate and move this first invasion, set of units that are in the invasion Convoy 1. And you would not be able to perform an amphibious landing on game turn 1 with the second convoy, even though it kind of reads that way. I can see where people are confused by this, but all it's trying to point out is that even though it's still game turn 1 and you pick the Friuli activation again, the second time, meaning on game turn 2, it would activate both the units that have already landed, and you would conduct the second amphibious invasion. The next section, the Folgore formation activates when it is drawn from the cup after the first Friuli activation. All allied activation markers go into the opaque cup for regular activations. There are no movement allowance effects on Allied units. That's there because in the following scenarios, there are movement allowance effects against the Allies because it's a surprise invasion and it represents their inability to understand what is going on across the islands and react as quickly as if they weren't surprised, right? So basically, you'll read in each scenario the various effects. I'm not going to go into a lot more detail in this particular one, but note that, there's these exceptions. There are details about why the scenario is the way it is. And again, it's because it's representing the various time frames. Like, for example, here, D, the following airfields do not exist. They were built after 1940, which this scenario represents. Don't be confused by some of these details. If you dig into it a bit, you'll understand the reasoning behind it, I should say. And of course, there are plenty of designer's notes and the book, again, that can better explain some of why this is. To continue on, though, with the airfields, just as an example, the Kendry airfield, 3 hexes, 1525 and adjacent. I'll show you here real quick. Here we go. Here is the Kendry airfield, and you'll see that the hexes and the victory condition marker here. This is not a victory condition, and it states that here in the details under that scenario's D example here. Takali, also 6 hexes, 269 and adjacent. That is this airfield here, which has all of those hexes highlighted in yellow. So let's move on to scenario 2. Scenario 2, you'll note here that, again, you're on the Malta map. This, in this case, is 1941 instead of 1940. And you have all turns with good weather, it's stating here. So you're not going to be rolling on the weather table, even though it shows the weather table here. It's doing so because in other scenarios, you're going to need the weather table. So again, don't be confused by the fact that it mentions, hey, the weather's always good. Why do you need the weather table there? It's used in various places. Again, first turn exceptions. These are all important details. This scenario in particular has a much larger array of forces. Here is the Allied setup card. It has a second fold. I can't show, maybe I can show all of it here. Yes. A bit more unit-wise. The axis setup for scenario 2 versus just scenario 1. I hope this is becoming clear. Note again, you're going to have different victory conditions. You have a completely different turn 1. Axis player again picks the invasion zone markers for the first amphibious invasion convoy before the Allied player places his units. Again, this is after placing the scenario 2 group A, which is this, group A. Here is group B. So the Allied player is going to place these units in their, I would recommend their historical location. Then the Axis player is going to go through and place, we have all airdrops on the first page, all the Kampfgruppe airdrops. And on the second, we have more airdrops in later turns, but also we have this invasion, amphibious invasion So this convoy, there must be another convoy here, or does this start with something other than an amphibious landing? Let's take a look here. Maybe it starts with airdrops, but anyway, I'll look at that in just a second. But you're going to place the invasion zone marker there before the Allied B units are placed. So the invasion convoy does not get the privilege of knowing where every Allied unit is going to be before they decide on whether they want to be in the Jaffa zone or the, Western invasion zone, whichever zone they're going to decide on, right? Hope that makes sense. It does say that they pick the invasion zone, but it does not start with the amphibious invasion, because you can see here that this is available in game turn 3. And there is no amphibious invasion other than convoy 1. So you would likely be starting, or you would have to start with a paradrop instead. So that is unique. I haven't played this scenario yet. Interesting. Again, make sure that you read the details within the scenario special rules and note how things are affected on game turn 1. You'll notice here also, this is unique for me. I haven't played a scenario yet. We're placing Axis activation markers in the opaque cup next turn for regular activation. So you're not going to get 2 activations during the first game turn in this scenario. Scenario 3 is Malta 1942. This is the largest. Of course, using the Malta map and the Scenario 3 setup cards. There are 9 game turns, which is shorter than the last one being, I think the last one was 11, wasn't it? No, the last one was 8. The first one was 11. So Scenario 1, being the smallest, is actually the longest, 11 game turns. Second largest is 8 game turns with all good weather, and the largest scenario is 9 game turns with all good weather. There's an optional rule for hot weather here. Haven't seen this before. This occurs automatically on the indicated turns. All infantry, engineers, parachute engineers, glider, and motorcycle infantry units of both players lose 1 efficiency rating point for all game functions cumulated with other effects. So I mentioned in the last episode that efficiency rating was used in units recovering from being disrupted. If you're the Italians, or if you're in an enemy zone of control, to recover from being disrupted, you would have to roll your efficiency rating or below. And since you're losing 1, this is going to affect recovery from disruption. That's interesting. In this case, place German airhead markers before any formation activation, but after all Allied unit placement. So after the placement of Group B units, then the German player airhead markers would be placed. Airhead markers represent supply for those paratroop units, glider units and such. The Axis 7th and the Ramkey formations are already activated together. So it's telling you during that initial turn 1 phase of the invasion, the surprise part, what's going to happen and which drift table to use. The Folgore formation conducts its paradrops when its activation marker is drawn. That's not AM again, that's activation marker. Place its airhead when the formation activates. All Allied activation markers go into the opaque cup for regular activation. Again, losing some movement points. So again, lots of details here that are unique to this particular scenario. it looks like the Axis units that are a part of the original invasion, the first part of the invasion, do not get a second activation in this one. I do not see that as being part. That's interesting. There's an optional rule here that I have not seen. Allied supply problems. Beginning game turn 7. During any reset phase, an Allied artillery unit cannot turn from fired to active unless it passes an efficiency rating check. Interesting. This is going to be great. I cannot wait to play this scenario. Have not done so yet. Axis player wins if he holds friendly any 6 victory conditions, and there's sudden victory, which is listed in the rules. So this is pretty standard. That victory condition is the same for a couple of different ones. Finally, for scenario 4, we have Leros in 1943. Of course, you're using the Leros map. The Allied set up cards for scenario 4, which I have over here a bit. I'll show in a moment. Scenario length is a full 11 turns. Game turns 1 and 2 are automatically good weather, but then you're rolling weather for everything after. And the Allied motor pool maximum is 2. And you can only use that motor pool at night. I already know about that one. Here are some differences in game turn 1. You can see that the scenario starts with an amphibious invasion, and the Axis player picks the invasion zone as usual before the Allied placement of Group B units. So after A, but before B. Axis player chooses either the Ost or West formation to activate, and then that group's activation marker goes back in the cup for a regular draw in game turn 1. So essentially you're going to get 2 activations for 1 of the Axis units. A paradrop is allowed during its regular formation draw, game turn 1 or game turn 2. So that means that it must be an amphibious invasion in game turn 1. Game turn 1, it cannot be an Axis paradrop during that surprise phase. It's got to be an amphibious invasion, and that's likely because that's historically what happened. There are other details here. I'm not going to go into a lot of it, but, you know, again, read them. Here's one that's about the Axis situation. See if I can't get this to be a little less shaky here. Special Axis situation. All Axis units are trained for amphibious invasion. Training is important. That's a die roll modifier during the amphibious invasions. Axis Ju-88 air units cannot conduct close air support. Their bases are too far away, so they can only be used for bombardment, while the Ju-87 Stukas can be used for close air support. They're not as good for bombardment anyway. Paradrop, use drift table B for both Kampfgruppes. They drop complete. They do not drop them into multiple hexes. So this is unique as well. You're still going to roll on the drift table, but once you roll and they land as a stack. And since the stacking limit is 9, you'll note on the setup card, I'll show you that here. You'll note on the setup card that the Kampfgruppe Kuna is a stacking of 9, 3, 2, and 1 headquarters with a 1. So it's exactly the 9 that you would have for the stacking limit. Some other details here that are important and leads me to showing you the map, the reorganization of Axis convoys. When you conduct your amphibious landing, you're going to go through some different phases, and that's shown in the expanded sequence of play here. Basically, it's conducted during the naval transport phase here. You can see there in steps B, move units either to an amphibious zone box or an invasion zone delayed box from another invasion zone. Well, there's some differences in the map that I'll get to here in a minute, but instead of that, instead of using those boxes, which are normally on the map, and you can see an example up here, this is the Malta map, it has an available and delayed holding box for this particular invasion zone. It's labeled here, the Jaffa invasion zone. However, in Invasion Laros, there are no boxes. This confuses a lot of people. Instead, it uses a convoy reorganization box on the setup card. So you can see here, I had units that were delayed, and they had to come back here instead of being in the delayed invasion holding box. Here they'll be reorganized. Another invasion zone marker, you can see that convoy listed here is the invasion zone marker, and then it'll come in a subsequent turn. So it's not just going to go into a box on the map, but instead come back to the setup card. This seems to get a lot of people. And that leads me to showing the map. Again, the Invasion Laros maps. Here you can see the paradrop drift diagram. It tells you in the scenario that you're to use table B, and it has table B and does not include table A on the map. The motor pool only goes up to 2 because that's what's in the scenario. The weather table has some turns that you roll on, so therefore it has that. Here in comparison is the Invasion Malta map. You can see that the motor pool tracker goes up higher. The game turn again has weather tables, even though some scenarios do not require it and are good weather through the entire thing. There are some scenarios using this map that do use the roll. It has every victory condition hex marked, but not all of them are used in every scenario. Again, it's time-based. A couple of these airfields were not there in 1940 or 41. And of course, within these invasion zones, you have an available and a delayed box for each one of them. And they're all over the map. You also have both of the paradrop drift diagrams, some procedures. You have all of the things that are related to each scenario already defined, whether they're entirely used or not. Again, I've used the airfield as an example. But I want to also point out that there is this red line here that you can see is the definition between the Northern Brigade and the Central Brigade sectors. This one for the Northern Brigade, see, it is very odd shaped, mainly defined by the terrain. So the Northern Sector Brigade is here, Central here. Here is the line for the Central and Southern Brigade. I'll try and follow this a bit slowly. And then back up to show you how the Southern Sector is defined. So there are regions that are controlled by different formation organizations, and rather than having particular headquarters that are dictating distances to be under their command, it is more of a regional area. and units can move between those regions, and there are rules that define who is fighting within what organization in what region and how that affects scenarios and gameplay. Also, we have the boxes for the activation pool markers. You can skip an activation if you want. You can only do one skip, so you're kind of like trading markers, even though it's a big box. If you picked one activation, you would hide it from the other player and say, I'm not going to use this right now, I'm going to pass, and it would move on to the next activation. Then the next time you picked an activation marker for your side, let's say it's the Allies, then you might decide, oh, well, I don't want this one, I'm going to put it in the pool, and I'm going to take the one from the pool and I'm going to use it. So let's say the invasion was starting in the northern brigade sector here, and you chose something else, and you said, well, I want to hold that. So you'd place it in the Allied activation pool, and then the next time you might draw something that is better for you to skip and go back to the activation pool and use that one instead. The Axis Air Status cards, of course, is going to define what is ready, what is defined as bombardment, what's damaged, and which ones have flown. I think that's really about it. I think that covers everything that really needs to be said about the scenarios themselves. I talked about how the sequence of play is different. One other thing. Also, I want to show real quick Malta 1942 for scenario 3 here, and the information that's pertaining to the scenario and the special scenario rules and how that is affecting the expanded sequence of play, because it says that in this scenario the weather is all good. That turn 1, you're not completing a strategic segment with weather. It's already defined. The air readiness phase, in turn 1, all of the aircraft would already be undamaged and ready. So you're skipping the air readiness. There is no bombardment phase because it's a surprise. Invasions are surprise attacks. So there's no air bombardment or naval bombardment. Naval bombardment can only be conducted during night turns anyway, so it's irrelevant. And there are no Allied anti-aircraft units to activate because nothing has fired. So don't be confused by whether during the initial first turn of a scenario, whether you should have a strategic segment. There isn't one. It begins, as the scenario says, with the invasion. So you're going straight to the naval transport phase within the operations segment ground sequence, or to the airborne operations if it's scenario 3, I believe, where it's not an amphibious invasion, but rather an airdrop. So I hope that helps cover everything. I really, really love this game. I think everybody should be playing it. If you're not, pick it up from Legion Games. It's excellent. Vance von Borries is a great designer, and you will have many, many hours of enjoyment. If you get John Burt's book to go along with it, you can play this over and over and over again and try different things. And really, it's a lot of bang for your buck. No pun intended. So that's it. Stay tuned for more.